Okay, so at this point we've already reviewed what a systematic review is. And up to this point we've looked at all single studies to appraise. This is a little different. This is a compilation of studies. So, since we already know what a systematic review is, I'm not going to go into detail about that because there is a separate tutorial, separate video discussing systematic reviews. This is just to move a little further into some of the aspects of systematic reviews to help you understand what you're critically appraising. And I'm going to use the group article that I provided. This is Constraint-Induced Movement Therapy in the Treatment of the Upper Limb in Children with Hemiplegic Cerebral Palsy, a Cochrane Systematic Review. Okay, so first and foremost, let me just talk a little bit about the main points or some of the main points of what you're looking for in this article and what we're trying to prove. And I know a lot of these terms can be difficult, but that's why we're doing it, so that we can work through it. And it's important for you to be able to critically appraise multiple types of research. So you know within this systematic review, clearly they've picked a specific question. And they found multiple articles that support that question to determine their answer about whatever it is that they're looking at. In this case, it's cerebral palsy and constraint-induced movement. I want to start with homogeneity and heterogeneity because those are two of the more difficult aspects of systematic reviews that you're going to be looking for. So let's just dive in a little bit and talk about what that is. So when you have studies that are put together for a systematic review, they will be different because you have a specific question and then you're finding individual studies that were done on that topic, and then you're compiling them together and using all of those studies to determine if it's true, if it's valid or not, whatever it is that you're looking for. And you're doing this because there are often so many articles done on a question, but those are just individual studies, so it's sometimes just not enough evidence. So you want to compile all of those. And then remember, systematic reviews are at the top when it comes to validity. You want to put all those together and see if all of those studies done can help answer the question as a whole. So when you put these studies together, there are going to be some differences between them, right? Because they weren't all done for this one study. They were all studies done on their own. And then now we're just using those articles, that secondary data, to ask our question. So if there's any kind of variability among the studies, then we're going to say that there is some type of heterogeneity. So that's the probably most basic way to look at it. If there's any type of variability among the studies, then we're going to say there's heterogeneity. We need consistency among the studies, and the consistency is what gives us homogeneity. Okay? Now let's talk a little more about heterogeneity because I want to talk about the types. So when you see variability among participants, interventions, and even outcomes, this is where we get heterogeneity from, and often we'll call it clinical heterogeneity. When you see variability in the study decision and the risk of bias, often we'll call that methodological heterogeneity. And if you see variability in intervention effects being evaluated, we'll often call this statistical heterogeneity. And often statistical heterogeneity is a consequence of either both clinical and meth heterogeneity. There's a lot of diversity, point blank and period. We want to decipher that diversity, okay? So when you're doing your actual appraisal, you're going to be asked, is there heterogeneity or is there homogeneity? That's step one. Now, when there's homogeneity, we're pretty much saying there's not very much diversity. All the studies are the same. So that's pretty much it for that aspect. And this is general, so I'm not going to go into more detail than that because we're still learning what all of this is. But let's talk a little bit more about the heterogeneity. Now, again, assessment of consistency of effects across studies is essential. And because we need to assess for consistency, if there is heterogeneity, then we need to add a meta-analysis. And that's generally where you'll find those forest plots. Unless we know how consistent the results of the studies are, we cannot determine the other part that we're looking at within systematic review, and that's the generalization of findings, right? So we also focus on what is the generalization of findings that we can use this to provide. So, in order to do this, we have to test for heterogeneity, and we use meta-analysis to do so. Now, tests for heterogeneity, are commonly used to decide on methods for combining studies and for concluding consistency or inconsistent findings. So we're looking for either consistent or inconsistent findings. Okay? Part of the hard part of doing this is understanding how do you interpret that. Let's walk through the article a little bit and let's first and foremost see what we're looking at. That's always helpful. So just like most of the articles that you've already reviewed, you always have a background. They're talking about what they're looking at. From here, we'll go down and you also see materials and methods. So they're explaining to you their objectives, their literature search, where they got the data from, what data they chose and why, and how all of that data is related to their question. This section is a little different than what you're used to seeing because in the randomized control trials that we have looked at previously, they're one trial, they're one study. So a lot of the materials and methods that you're reading focus on choosing that patient population. In this case, these are studies that have already been completed, and in this case, one of their selection criteria for studies that they use in the systematic review is randomized controlled trials. So their methods and selection of criteria focus more so on their question and then picking articles of studies that are already completed that fit the question that they're trying to ask. So it's a little different. Again, just to recap, the randomized controlled trials that we looked at in the past were studies that were done, and in those studies that were done, most of the methods and selection criteria and that kind of thing focused on the sample size base or focused on characteristics to build that individual study. Okay? For this systematic review, they're looking at secondary data. So in this case, they're looking at articles that are already completed, studies that are already done within the topic, within the range of the question that they're trying to ask. So a lot of their selection criteria will focus on choosing articles that had all of those characteristics to help address their question. So before, individual studies focused on their patient population, their study mechanics. This systematic reviews focus on picking articles that kind of fit all of their needs to address the question, but they're looking at articles, okay? So they still have a sample size, that kind of thing, but again, it's using secondary data, so we're looking at articles already completed. So, just to go back up, again, you have materials and methods, literature search, how they found it, the same way. There's no change in that. Selection criteria, how they chose their articles. Some things that you'll look for are things like this, where it says, due to the vast different intensity of treatment provided with each type of therapy, these terms are not interchangeable, and studies investigating each treatment type were therefore reviewed separately. Okay, so that might tell us there might be some variability based on what they're looking for. You have evaluation of the methodology, the quality. So again, same way. They have, in the studies that we looked at in the past, there's always methodology. We're always looking at the quality of the methodology, right? So they're doing the same here. They have two authors independently reviewing the titles and the abstracts of articles. So instead of, well, I shouldn't say instead of, but in like the randomized control trials that we previously looked at, you had authors who assessed for like things like sample size criteria, inclusion and exclusion criteria, those kind of things, for that one study. Same thing here, but they also have to assess for the quality of the articles that they choose. They can't just choose any article. They have to be a certain amount of good articles that fit what they're looking for. And then you have study characteristics, same, and data analysis, right? So data from eligible studies were extracted using data extraction tool, summarized independently by the two reviewers. The authors of primary studies were contacted to provide information when missing or incomplete data were encountered, meaning if they had an article that they were looking at, they would contact the author of that article to get a little more information that they needed that wasn't clear based on the randomized controlled based on the article that they read. And we've had that, right? Where you look at articles and it looks like there's some missing data or something missing that doesn't make sense by the time you get to the conclusion of that article. So they reach out. They ask a few more questions. So I'm going to go down. Or actually, I want to go back to study characteristics. So the graphs will include characteristics of the studies that they used, and then within here they'll talk about the different trials from the different articles. So like the largest trial had 45 subjects, and here's the author, and they use this kind of design to compare this type of protocol with whatever they did, right? So they're going to talk a little bit about the different articles that they chose and what happened. And then, as always, they're going to do a review analysis of what they determined. Okay. And then a discussion of what they found. So this main section, so I would, to be honest, we could just really say the whole thing. You have to, of course, read the whole article to figure out what you're looking for. But a lot of the selection from the material methods and down, we're going to determine what's the if there's homogeneity or if there's heterogeneity. And if we just want to put it in more basic terms, how much diversity is in this study, right? Is it pretty much all comparable? Is it all the same? Or is there a lot of diversity? So again, I'm going to say, to test for heterogeneity, we commonly use, or test for heterogeneity are commonly used to decide on methods for combining studies and for concluding if there are consistent or inconsistent results or findings, either way. Okay? And our first thought is that a test for heterogeneity examines the null hypothesis that all the studies that are being reviewed in the systematic review are evaluating the same effect. And from there, we'll use different type of statistical equations to determine if that's true.